For the past 3 years, I've observed a conflict between the Ho-Chunk Nation legislature and the Ho-Chunk Nation president. Although, in my humble opinion, the president has done a poor job of messaging to the people what he's trying to accomplish by filing lawsuits against the legislature, my observations have been that he's been trying to raise issues of constitutionality in regards to actions of the legislature. This seems to me to be a noble effort. After all, the Ho-Chunk Nation Constitution is the framework of our government, and from what I have read, it is an effort to maintain four co-equal branches of government. I've beat it to death, but recent examples of legislative overreach have been language proposed in the Legislative Organization Act, the LOA, and the Gaming Ordinance, where the legislature presumed to take full control of all aspects of the nation's business, and the Office of the General Counsel Establishment Organization Act, where they tried to take over the General Counsel. Executive branch powers per the Constitution. Obviously, these were cited as unconstitutional, and to date, they have backed off of that effort. I mentioned recently what I see as attorney malpractice and even allowing this sort of language in these laws, but that's for another day. My beef with our judiciary is that there seems to be a reticence to hear cases that are begging for judiciary interpretation of the Constitution. There is this issue of standing. The lower court has rejected cases that they state lack standing. The court has stated in past cases that the plaintiff did not suffer personal harm. Therefore, the case cannot be heard. Now, I am by no means an expert on civil procedure, and I suppose the Ho-Chunk Nation trial court has a legal argument that because a tribal member who identifies unconstitutional violations perpetrated by the legislature cannot identify a particular harm, they cannot hear the case. But that seems a bit too in the weeds, especially for a formative government navigating its way towards a more perfect government. If a simple tribal member like me can see what are fairly obvious overreach actions by the legislature, why won't the trial court simply hear the arguments, as they have in the past? They could hear the case and simply punt, rather than make an affirmative decision, either in favor or disfavor of the legislature. And the issue could then be appealed and heard by the Supreme Court of the Ho-Chunk Nation. But to not even hear an issue of constitutionality because there is no standing, demonstrated by the plaintiff, just has a look of cowardice. I get that the trial court is funded by a fickle legislature, but for goodness sakes, just exercise your power as a co-equal branch of the government, and we, the people, will pressure the legislature to properly fund the judiciary as what was intended in the Constitution, provided, of course, that the judiciary make it known to the people that they were retaliated against by the legislature. I also have the most rudimentary understanding that civil procedures usually end up with a monetary award being mandated. But what if the plaintiff simply wants the judicial branch of the government to rule on constitutionality? That's all. No money, just a ruling that better secures constitutional actions of our governments. I would argue that when the legislature overreaches in their actions, all Ho-Chunk tribal members are harmed. Couldn't a clever attorney devise an argument that clearly demonstrates the harm to all of the people when the legislature operates outside of its constitutional boundaries? Now, by violating provisions in the Constitution that was designed to protect and assist our people, isn't that harm enough? Does it require the people to develop a coalition or a group with a catchy name, like the group that illegally received funding for the fake General Counsel in Black River last year? My problem with all of this is, why do we, the people, have to contort ourselves into a pretzel just to get a judicial interpretation of our Constitution? Why can't I simply hire an attorney when I see a clear-cut constitutional violation perpetrated by the legislature, or the president for that matter, and have the constitutionality of my argument heard in court? I wouldn't be seeking a monetary reward. I just want a more perfect government that observes and respects the separation of powers enumerated in our Constitution, so that we may advance beyond the 30-year malaise we have endured. I would welcome a legal scholar, or even a Supreme Court justice, or the Ho-Chunk, or of the Ho-Chunk Nation, or former Supreme Court justice, to come on my podcast and explain why there are obstacles in having our judiciary execute their constitutional duty to interpret the Constitution for all of the people's benefits. Again, I am sure with my lack of knowledge of civil procedure, someone could explain to me why interpreting the Constitution becomes a seemingly insurmountable obstacle course. We are just letting attorneys run interference in what I think should be a simple exercise. Now, we are a relatively formative government. Our Constitution is only, 28 years old? The U.S. Constitution is 246 years old. How have we accelerated to a point where we have embraced the white man's rule of law, where we could simply set aside the technicalities and get to the point? Is an issue constitutional or not? That's all we need at this early stage in our government, so that we may effectively advance the interests of all the Ho-Chunk people. The president of the Ho-Chunk Nation has been trying to establish guardrails for the Ho-Chunk Nation's legislature and keep them in their lane, all for the benefit of our government, present and future, and for our people. It sure would be helpful if the judicial branch of the Ho-Chunk Nation would get off the sidelines and get in the game